Hey Commando heads, it's your boy, the Clippy Commander, here to graphically design things. So today we're going to be doing something a little bit different than what I've done so far. We're going to be reworking this. So when you walk over a level node, it gives you information on the level and all of the objectives within that level and whether or not you've completed them. And it gives you an option down here to show cutscenes. So I want to rework this because it kind of looks terrible. It just looks really bad. Since I made this very early on, I've learned better techniques for displaying information. I can make it more dynamic and less static. So I have a mock-up of what I kind of want to do. I'm gonna have it on the top instead of on the side with the chapter title and number on the top and the medals underneath. I'm not sure if I'm gonna have it span the whole screen. I'll probably make the width around 3/4 of the screen total instead of having it cover the whole top like this. And these beautiful circles are going to be the medals. And at the bottom of the screen on its own separate background, there will be the show cutscenes button. And in the future, if I add any more buttons, I can just add them down here separate from everything else. The way that I determine whether or not to show the level information is on the player object, which is kind of stupid because first I have to determine whether or not I'm on the world map, and then after that I have to check whether or not the player is currently touching a level node, which doesn't happen that often. So there's no need for this code to be inside of the player object. I can get rid of like 50, 70 lines of code and just organize it better, make this whole area easier to read and less cluttered. And the player's draw GUI event, most of it is taken over by this level node drawing, which starts on line 20 and ends all the way on line 123. So there's a lot of text variables and other Boolean variables that are unneeded and can be transferred over to another object as I rework this system. So first I'm going to create a new object, place it in the world map, and then that object will check whether the player is touching a level node. Because if I put it on the level node, every node would check every frame whether or not the player is touching it, which, as the number of levels increase, will increase the amount of processing the computer has to do, which causes lag. So if we put it to one object checking the player, that will be one object executing one code instead of 100 objects executing one code. And 100 is greater than 1. So let's go create that new object. Alright, so that was pretty simple. I just transferred all the code to a separate object, and now anytime the player moves over a node, it does the exact same thing as it did before. The thing is that I got rid of 63 lines of code from the player's step event, 103 lines of code from the draw GUI event, and all of these variables from the player's create event. Since all of this was only relevant to the world map, that was just a bunch of memory that was being used for practically nothing whenever the player is on the screen, which is all the time. So player doesn't need any of that anymore. Now that I know all of this works, I can go through and organize it a little bit before I go and redo the entire GUI. Let's do that. I updated the code just to make it a bit more readable, more organized, added some comments to the step event. I'll go through and do the GUI event once we actually redesign the UI. This section is actually for when the player walks over a bonus node for the first time. There's a little tutorial that teaches you how to use special power. So I just condensed that down a lot since it was spread out and took up a bunch of space that isn't really necessary anymore. Maybe sometime I'll go through how the dialogue system works, but that'll be its own completely separate video. Now it's time to do this, redesigning the UI, the meat of this project. So let's get to it. Alright, I'm pretty happy with this actually. I can still tweak it a little bit, but I think this is a lot nicer than it was before. However, there's still a tweak we can make to make this look nicer. Right now, when you walk over it, it just immediately snaps on. It's on, and it's off. On, and it's off. That can be jarring, especially if you're walking over a lot of these at once. If you're walking over a line of these nodes like this, it's just flashing on and off constantly, and that can get a bit annoying, especially if you're traversing the world map to get to a different level or to replay something to get a medal. So what we can do is we can fade the opacity of the image in. With this function, we can draw a sprite at an X and a Y position with a unique X and Y scale, rotation, coloring, and alpha. Alpha is a value from 0 to 1 that describes the opacity. So if I made it 0.25, so you can see now it's very transparent. And those sprites are square sprites with the center or the pivot point in the middle center of the sprite. So when I do 25 X scale, 6 Y scale, I'm pretty much drawing it at the center of the screen at the very top, and half of it is off of the screen above and half of it is off the screen below, and it's 25 wide, so that would be 12.5 to the left and to the right of the center of the screen. And I do the same thing except for I have the Y at 180, which is the bottom of the screen for the GUI, and I make it slightly shorter. Now what we can do is we can determine if the player is over a node, we can increase a value a little bit, and if they're not over a node, we can decrease the value. So let's do that. Alright, so that looks a lot nicer. Let's see how that looks walking over a line. Yep, that's a lot more comfortable to look at. So the way that we do that is we use a clamp and a lerp function. Clamping just keeps a variable between two values, a minimum and a maximum. Since the opacity of the image can only be on a scale of 0 to 1, I just want to keep that value between 0 and 1. So if this lerp function ever returns something below or above 0 or 1, it'll just make sure that it never goes above that. And that won't actually do anything bad, but, you know, always better be safe than sorry. And a lerp function, this is a custom function that I made. The lerp function is just a curve that smoothly transitions a variable between two values. So the function takes three variables, value 1, value 2, and the amount. The first value is the current value, so that would be the current opacity. The second value is the goal, and the third value is how quickly you want to go between the two variables. So let's just finish up making that a little nicer if we can. Just test out some other variables to see if I can make it look any better. A thing about the lerp function is that it slows down as you reach the upper and lower limit that you want to reach. So if I just make this a little higher and a little lower, than what I want it to be. The value will be clamped at 0 and 1, but it'll go a lot quicker to the maximum instead of very slowly creeping up to the highest or lowest value that I want it to be. Yeah, it just fades in a lot quicker to 1 and fades out a lot quicker to 0, but it still goes at about the speed that I want it to. So I'm very happy with how this turned out. Now all I have to do is add all the text information and the metals and make that look nice. So let's get to that. Alright, so this is how it turned out looking. I think it's okay. Yeah, I might have to change some stuff later, but this is a lot nicer than it was originally. So now what we're going to do is add rotation to the metals. So there are 9 metal slots, so we have an array of 9 integers. The iRandom function will choose a random integer between 0 and 512, and the rotation of the metal will be added to the drawn sprite. So we do metal rotation at the index of I, which means that as it goes down the list, it'll take the correct metal for each slot from this array, and all we have to do is... My explanation here sucked, so we store an integer for each metal slot, then we add to that integer every frame, and then we take the sign value of that integer, which keeps the rotation between the positive and negative values that we set the max to. It just adds a little bit of life to the select screen that was not there before when they would just sit and stare directly at you. So we have this nice little animation to liven it up a little bit, but the next thing we need is the actual objectives. So right now, there's no way to tell how to earn each of these medals. Originally, I was thinking that I would hover over the medal and this box would extend farther down and the text would spawn in there, but I'm not sure how that would look since it is very close to the top of the player's head. So I'm thinking that I might replace it and put it down here. So you would hover over this medal and it would pop up from the bottom, slide up, and say whatever the objective is, and that would just tell you how to get the medals. Alright, I'm pretty happy with how this looks. I added a little bit of a feature where if you hover over metal, it just gets a little bit bigger. The way that works is that, firstly, to determine which metal is being hovered, I use this function that pretty much just checks if the mouse is within these X and Y coordinates, and it uses which position from 0 to 9. Starting from the left to the right, it adds the width of the metals and a little spacing around them. If your mouse is hovering a metal, it determines that you're hovering a metal and finds out the index of the metal that you're hovering, and from there it just does the same thing as when the text box goes up and down for the metals. It just clamps and lerps between a maximum and minimum, and I can actually increase the metal rotation a little bit too. So I can just, if you're hovering over the metal, yeah, so now the metal speeds up a little bit when you hover over it. But I'm really happy with how this turns out, or how it turned out. I think it looks a lot nicer than it did before. So the last thing we need to do is add the cutscene selection button, and I think I had a pretty good idea for how I can do that now, using a lot of the new techniques that we've covered in this video so far. So there we go, Commando heads. You can switch back and forth with the cutscenes when you hover over this button in the corner. It's now out of the way and not taking up a ton of space on the screen like it was before down here. Hovering over the metals shows you the description of how to get them. I think this turned out really nice. Fades in and out pretty slowly, so it won't be as big of a seizure hazard as you're walking over here. So that's pretty much it for this video. I still need to go through and finish this up, but I think the main core of what I wanted to get done and show you guys has been completed. I think this looks pretty good, and if you think it looks pretty good, smash that like button and hit the subscribe button as well. If you don't think it looks good, do those things too, please. That'd be cool of you. Stay cool, Commando heads.